සියලුම SLT මොබිටෙල් සේවාවන් MySLT ඇප් එක හරහා කරගන්න. සියලුම SLT මොබිටෙල් සේවාවන් MySLT ඇප් එක හරහා කරගන්න.
දසනකාන්ති චූර්ණය සහිත ලීවර් ආයුෂ් දන්තාලේපය දත්වල ඇති ප්‍රශ්න 10ක් වළකයි.
Tonight, beginning of a long road. Sri Lanka reaches staff-level agreement with IMF, $2.9 billion to be disbursed to Sri Lanka over a period of 4 years.
Is only the beginning of a long road ahead for Sri Lanka, and if creditors are not willing to provide these assurances and would undermine its repayment capacity.
Traditional friendly neighbour. China expresses readiness to find a proper way to handle outstanding Sri Lankan debts. Says Chinese financial institutions have already reached out to Sri Lankan authorities. Testimony to commitment. President Ranil Wickremesinghe says IMF Pact is a testimony to Sri Lanka's commitment towards necessary reforms. Authorities to meet creditors over the next few weeks. Not the right way. Raising value-added tax to 15% is not an option, says Northern MP M.A. Sumantharan. All this and much more coming up tonight on First at 9. This Thursday, the 1st of September 2022.
Vim Deera milliliter CA Smart Pack එක රුපියල් 85ට දැන් වෙළඳ පොලේ.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. I'm Andrew Bernard. Now in your top story for today, the first step towards finalizing Sri Lanka's request for an International Monetary Fund Extended Fund Facility was made today with the announcement of a staff-level agreement reached between the IMF mission to Colombo and Sri Lankan authorities. The IMF staff agreed to a $2.9 billion facility for Sri Lanka that would be dispersed through the next 4 years. Senior IMF Missions Chief Peter Brewer, announcing the outcome of their work in Sri Lanka, emphasized that it is important for the country's creditors to provide the necessary reassurances on debt restructuring.
IMF staff and the authorities have reached staff-level agreement to support Sri Lanka's economic policies with a 48-month arrangement under the so-called Extended Fund Facility of about $2.9 billion. The arrangement is subject to the approval of IMF management and the IMF Executive Board in the period ahead and is contingent on the implementation of a number of so-called prior actions by the authorities, as well as receiving assurances from international partners, including bilateral and private creditors, on their financial commitments in support of the program. This staff-level agreement is only the beginning of a long road ahead for Sri Lanka to emerge from the crisis. Now, because Sri Lanka's debt is assessed to be unsustainable, debt relief from Sri Lanka's creditors will be required to ensure debt sustainability. Having a path to restore debt sustainability, so-called financing assurances, is necessary for approval by the IMF Executive Board. And additional financing from multilateral partners will be needed to close financing gaps.
If in the event China doesn't agree for the conventional debt structuring as we know it, what is the situation as far as the IMF is concerned?
If creditors are not willing to provide these assurances, that would indeed deepen the crisis here in Sri Lanka and would undermine its repayment capacity. So a deepening crisis means that essentially the resources available to service the debt would become less. So it is actually in the interest of all creditors to collaborate together and with Sri Lanka so that Sri Lanka can emerge from this crisis as quickly as possible and regain its repayment capacity and service this new debt that will come out of these debt negotiations. So it really is in the interest of all creditors to work with Sri Lanka on this front.
In the disbursements period, will it be equally distributed, like about $750 million per annum? Will the disbursement will come like that, or the first tranche will be a major share?
The so-called extended fund facility agreed with between us and the authorities extend for 4 years. Then the total amount is distributed across over these 4 years. And the first disbursement will come at the time of IMF board approval, which is subject to actions, as Peter mentioned. And then it's going to be distributed across program period. And each disbursement is tied to the successful review by the executive board. $2.9 billion is contribution from the IMF. Usually IMF program comes with other financing from multilateral creditors. We call it catalytic effect. That will add to our contribution of $2.9 billion so that the program financing actually larger than $2.9 billion.
The IMF mission team for Sri Lanka added that they stand ready to present the proposal to its management regarding the staff level agreement in order to obtain IMF board approval instead of waiting for the Sri Lankan government to secure assurances from the country's creditors.
But what is the sequencing? Will this be put to the management and the board while waiting for the government to come back with those financial assurances? Will they happen parallel, or are you going to wait for the government to secure those financial guarantees, come to agreement on that sustainability before you can stamp with the management and the board to actually go ahead?
We stand ready to put this agreement to our management, and then to our management approves it to then put it forward to the executive board as soon as these conditions that I mentioned are satisfied. So we do need to await now for these conditions to take place.
Is this $2.9 billion over this many months, is this sufficient for Sri Lanka to sustain itself?
The answer is yes. And I would like to highlight that catalytic role of IMF-supported program that will also provide confidence to our multilateral lenders, and that should be able to provide financing for the duration of the program.
Senior IMF mission chief for Sri Lanka, Peter Brewer, then explained how any delays in acquiring creditors' assurances would impact the Sri Lanka's economic crisis.
So Sri Lanka really is experiencing a deep crisis. We are very concerned about immediate financing needs for the import of essentials, medicines, food, fuel, and support in the short term is really urgent in order to avert a humanitarian crisis. Delays arising from the need to obtain these financing assurances that I had talked about, meaning a path towards restoring debt sustainability. Delays in that process would deepen the crisis further and negatively affect Sri Lanka's debt repayment capacity, because it would not be growing as quickly and as much as it could otherwise. So prompt creditor coordination and transparent collaboration is really key to advancing the debt restructuring efforts.
Now, reacting to Sri Lanka's staff-level agreement with the International Monetary Fund, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says the agreement is a testimony of the government's commitment to carry out the necessary reforms and to offer a better life to Sri Lankan citizens. The head of state added that this paves the way for the provision of financial support from the IMF and other development partners that should help Sri Lanka address current external imbalances and to restart the country's economic engine. The president said in his statement that he is grateful to the IMF team, the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka for working towards the agreement in record time. Now, with this announcement of the IMF's readiness to move forward with a staff-level agreement with Sri Lanka, the president of the country termed this as the beginning of a new economic era for the country. During a meeting with the IMF mission in Colombo, the head of state said that this is the best commitment Sri Lanka could make for the next 25 years to reorient the country towards an economic, export-led country.
A meeting between President Ranil Wickremesinghe and the delegation of the IMF mission to Colombo was held this morning at the Presidential Secretariat.
I guess I should start by reporting that indeed we are ready to move to staff-level agreement on the basis of what has been agreed in the Memorandum of Economic and Financial Policies.
This is an important step in the history of our country. It's the first time that we've declared bankruptcy. And this is a key not only to resolving the immediate issues of rising from the bankruptcy crisis and the debt moratorium, but is also key to ensure that in the medium term, our social sectors are protected and both the economic and our social, both the economic and the social aspect of our lifestyle will certainly not have any further setbacks. So this is what we are committed to. And it is also, for me, I would consider this to be a beginning of a new economic era, where we are committed to a very competitive export-oriented industry while maintaining and improving our social standards as well as looking after the vulnerable groups. The beginning will be difficult, but we know as we go on, we can make more progress. It's our commitment that matters now, that we should not only fulfill the targets here, but to get ahead of them. And appeal to the country that let us reorient ourselves to an export-oriented industry, to economy, which will also make it easier for us to sustain our social services. I'd like to say, when I was born, Sri Lanka had no debt. Let this be the beginning and the way forward, because on the 75th anniversary of our independence, this is the best commitment we can make for the next 25 years.
Now, meanwhile, China expressed their readiness to find a proper way to handle Sri Lanka's mature debt related to China and to help overcome the current difficulties faced by the country. The Chinese embassy in Colombo said that as a traditional friendly neighbor of Sri Lanka and a major shareholder of the International Monetary Fund, China has been always encouraging the IMF and other international financial institutions to continue to play a positive role in supporting Sri Lanka's response to the current difficulties. The embassy went on to say that China has also supported efforts to ease debt burden in Sri Lanka in order to realize sustainable development in the country. Spokesperson of the Chinese mission in Colombo said the Chinese financial institutions reached out to Sri Lankan authorities as soon as the government announced suspension of international debt payments in April 2022. The spokesperson added that they hope Sri Lanka will work actively with China in a similar spirit to find out a feasible solution. Now, the Indian High Commission to Sri Lanka, Gopal Bagle, assures that India will continue to be supportive of Sri Lanka and stand through the current challenges. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ali Sabri, said India's progress and prosperity will be beneficial for Sri Lanka to navigate the current economic challenges. They expressed these remarks while addressing an event in Colombo last evening.
India's progress and prosperity is good for Sri Lanka. We need to understand single countries have not developed the regions which are developed. Take the Americas, the whole Northern America. If you take Gulf, the whole Gulf region. If you take European Union, the whole European Union. If you take recently the ASEAN, the whole ASEAN region. So similarly, India's progress, India's development, India's steady progress is good for Sri Lanka. And I'm sure India will carry Sri Lanka also through with that development. And we are looking forward to do that.
Excellency, you said that you would come out of the woods. Surely you would. But I can also assure you that when you walk out of the woods, we will be walking with you. There is no doubt about it. Because it cannot be another way. It is natural. It is what has been through the history. It has been the nature, the very essence of the relationship between India and Sri Lanka. We will continue to be supportive. We will continue to work with the people of Sri Lanka in these difficulties because, as has been said, the challenge is an opportunity. Let us work together. Let us continue to work together to convert this challenge into an opportunity and convert that opportunity into peace, prosperity, and progress. India believes in the growth of everyone in the neighborhood. Sri Lanka has given to the world so much. Sri Lanka has so much to give to the world. Let us continue to work together and let us continue to be the examples of great neighbors, great friends, and not only great neighbors and great friends, but a great family.
Stay with us for more news after this short break.
කාලගුණය කොහොමුණත් Rhino නං වාලට safe තමයි මුළු ගෙදරම. Rhino cement roofing sheets. Then you know Rhino. I know.
Big 3.
Welcome back. Now the second day of the parliamentary debate on the appropriation bill presented by President Ranil Wickremesinghe on Tuesday for the remainder of the 2022 fiscal year was held during today's parliamentary session. Joining the debate, Chief Opposition Whip MP Lakshman Kiriyala said the main opposition Samagi Janabalawegaya stands against the proposal to hand over 52 state institutions to the private sector as part of the government's restructure plan. Meanwhile, Northern Parliamentarian of the Ilankai Tamil Arasu Katchi, M.A. Sumanthiran, while praising relief measures proposed in the amendment bill, pointed out that expanding the value-added tax threshold to 15% at a time when people are subject to severe hardship should not have been the government's solution to increase revenue.
ආයතන 52ක් ප්‍රතිගතකරණය කරන්න දාලා තියෙනවා. මේ කරන්න පුළුවන් ආයතන 52ක් මේකේ සේවකයෝ ලක්ෂයක් විතර වැඩ කරනවා. එයාගේ දරුවන්ගේ එක්ක ලක්ෂ 20ක් 25ක් වෙනවා. එතකොට මේ රීස්ට්‍රක්චර් කරනවා කියලා මෙවුවා පෞද්ගලිකත්වයට ලබා දෙන එකට අපි විරුද්ධයි. අපි කියන්නේ රාජ්‍ය යාන්ත්‍රණය තුලම ක්‍රමවේදයක් හදාගන්න. දැන් ඩෙකෝ එක තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම ටෙලිකොම් එක තියෙනවා. අන්නේ මොඩල්ස් අනුව අවශ්‍ය පීවරකට සේවකයන්ගේ සේවක අයිතිවාසිකම් ආරක්ෂා කරගෙන. අපි සූදානම් නැහැ මේ රීස්ට්‍රක්චරින් කරනවා කියලා සේවකයෝ එළියට දානවට. අපි ඒක තදින්ම විරුද්ධයි. අද රටේ ලොකුම ප්‍රශ්නේ මොකද්ද? ඩොලර් ගෙන්නන්නේ එකම යෝජනාවක් තියෙනවා. මේ අයවැය දැන් IMF එකෙන් $3 billion හම්බ වෙනවා කියනවා. මම ඔබතුමාට මතක් කරන්න කැමතියි අපි 2025 වෙනකන් අවුරුද්දකට ආව වශයෙන් ඊට වැඩි වෙයි ආව වශයෙන් $12 billion ඕන. ඒකෙන් භාගයක් අපේ අත්‍යවශ්‍ය භාණ්ඩ වලට ඉතුරු භාගෙ ණය ගෙවන්න. එතකොට දැන් $3 billion හම්බුනායි කියලා අපේ ප්‍රශ්නට උත්තරයක් තියෙනවද?
මේ අර්බුදයෙන් ගොඩ එන්නට පුළුවන් මාර්ගයට ජාත්‍යන්තරව තිබෙන සාකච්ඡාවල් සාර්ථක වීමෙන් පවතිනවා. ඉතාම සතුටුදායක තත්වයක පවතිනවා. ADB එක ඇතුළු එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ සංවිධාන රාශියක් අපගේ සහයෝගයට ඇවිල්ලා තිබෙනවා. ඉතින් අපි වගකීමෙන් මේ ඇති වී තිබෙන විශ්වාසය මත යලිත් රටත් ආර්ථිකයත් ගොඩනැගීම සඳහා වූ කාර්යභාරයට එක් වී කටයුතු කරමු. ඉන් පස්සේ පුළුවන් අපිට ඔබලා කියන කාලය අනුව ව්‍යවස්ථාව අනුව ඡන්දයන් පැවැත්වීම සඳහා ගමන් කරන්න.
අතුරු අයවැය සාකච්ඡාවට භාජනය වෙන මේ මොහොතේ අපිට පේනවා දසලක්ෂ ගණනින් අතරමං වුණු ජනතාවක් ඉන්නවා. ඒ අයගේ ප්‍රශ්න වලට විසඳුම් නැහැ. Millions are left behind. ඒ අයව මේ appropriations bill amendment again address කරලා නැහැ.
In November last year we approved a deficit of 1,600 billion. The interim budget that has been now proposed by the finance minister cum president, the deficit is 2,300 billion, and 85% of that is to be supplied by revenue from the country itself, and that is why you have increased the VAT rate. I heard speakers in the government saying, well, we complained about reducing the VAT rate. Yes, we complained. That was one of the main causes for this economic crisis, from 15% to 7%. But the answer doesn't lie in increasing it back to 15% after the country has fallen into this debt, and after the people have been subjected to all the hardship and the economic deprivement that they have been subjected to. That is not the answer. So the interim budget only heaps more misery on people. There are some good aspects with regard to relief. Some of the recipients, numbers being added, 726,000 more and all of that. But all that is taken away by an increase in VAT 3%, which is an indirect tax that all will have to bear. Therefore, increasing the deficit and hoping to supply that deficit through local revenue is not the answer. You have to comply with international human rights standards if you are to really get relief from the international community.
According to the new amendment for the year 2022, under which government expenditure has been revised, it shows a massive increase in recurrent expenditure for public administration as opposed to the allocation under the previous budget of 2022. Government should have reduced expenditure at a time of severe economic crisis that we undergo presently rather than raising it further while the public suffers from high inflation rates. benefits. If benefits were to be given to the penurious needy, some other expenditure should have been cut down, because inflation would not come down as the central bank was continuing to print money to meet expenses. Unless the government cuts down expenditure, including capital expenditure, we would not be able to reduce the inflation rates and stabilize the economy.
Now, sources confirm that former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is set to return to Sri Lanka on Saturday after nearly 2 months away from the country. Sri Lanka's former head of state left the country on the 13th of July after mass protests stormed key administrative locations in Colombo. He left for Singapore via the Maldives. Former President Gotabaya stayed in Singapore for a month and then flew to Thailand. Now in your business news, the task forces comprising heads of public and private sectors have been approved with a view to create good investment opportunities and to secure investors to Sri Lanka. Accordingly, 8 task forces have been established on the instructions of the President to cover all procedures, regulations and actions implemented by government agencies that provide services related to business activities in the country. Agencies providing services based on 8 areas such as starting new businesses, obtaining construction permits, registering a business property, obtaining loans, protecting small-scale investors and cross-border trades will be covered. President Secretary Samaneka Naika said this is part of the government's long-term efforts to create a favourable environment for investors in Sri Lanka. Now, the Colombo Bourse continued to rally with a substantial gain of 163 points following the announcement of the staff-level agreement with the IMF. The SBI shot up by over 150 points as soon as the market opened, as investors took positions and traded on index heavyweights. Moreover, LIOC and plantation stocks continued to be the retail favourite, and the index closed the day at 5-month high at 9,255. Turnover was maintained at 4.1 billion rupees, driven by active retail participation. Food, beverage and tobacco and energy sectors continued to lead the market turnover with a joint contribution of 47%. The market saw a net foreign inflow of 127.6 million rupees today. Now, meanwhile, the global stocks dropped and the dollar jumped after fresh COVID-19 lockdowns in China and gloomy data from the manufacturing powerhouse compounded investor worries that the global economy is faltering. Wall Street's S&P 500 fell by rather 1.1% in mid-morning trading today, leaving it on track to close down for a 5th day in what would be its longest losing streak since mid-July. The tech-heavy Nasdaq Composite dropped 1.9%, while Europe's stocks shed 1.7%. The latest bout of shelling highlights show that many investors are worried that surging energy prices will weigh on consumers and businesses worldwide, just as central banks are raising borrowing costs in an attempt to dump down blistering inflation. Now, worries over the prospects of the UK economy led the pound to slide by about 5% against the US dollar in August. The last time the pound fell so much against the dollar was in October 2016, in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. Sterling sank again today, dipping below $1.16 on the currency markets. Analysts said the fall reflects the darkening outlook for the economy, with consumers and businesses raising prices and soaring energy bills. The Bank of England has predicted the UK will fall into recession towards the end of this year. And that's all we have for you this evening. Join us again tomorrow at the same time. Good night.